In 1666, after weeks of drought and suffocating August heat, a fire broke out in Jamestown, Virginia, near a cluster of wooden buildings that already smelled of pitch, smoke, tobacco, and river mud. By then, the English colony had survived starvation, disease, war, and desperation so severe that, half a century earlier, during the winter of 1609 and 1610, roughly 4 out of every 5 settlers had died. 4 out of 5. The survivors lived in a world where a failed harvest could become a death sentence, where salt was precious, where meat spoiled quickly, and where a single hog, slowly cooked over coals, could feed an entire settlement. And at the centre of that survival was something so ordinary now that you might pass it on a highway sign without thinking twice. Barbecue, a word on a restaurant menu, a backyard weekend, smoke drifting over a fence in July, a paper plate with beans, slaw, ribs, brisket, or pulled pork, depending on where you happen to be standing and who is willing to argue with you. So how did slow-cooked meat over fire become one of America's most beloved foods, and also one of its biggest rivalries? How did smoke, salt, wood, and patience become identity, politics, memory, and pride? That was colonial Virginia. But the story of barbecue starts thousands of years before English settlers built fences along the James River, before Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, before anyone in Europe had ever heard the word that would become barbecue. It starts wherever human beings first learned that fire could do more than frighten the dark. It could transform food. Think about that for a second. For most of human history, cooking was not convenience, it was survival. Raw meat could be tough, dangerous, and difficult to digest. Fire softened it. Heat killed many pathogens. Smoke helped preserve it. Slow cooking turned sinew and collagen into something tender enough to share among children. Elders, hunters, gatherers, and travellers. This was not a hobby. It was not a weekend pastime. It was chemistry before chemistry had a name. The earliest controlled use of fire is still debated by archaeologists, and the timeline changes as new evidence appears. Some sites suggest human ancestors used fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, possibly earlier, by the time Homo sapiens spread across Africa, Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. Fire was already one of humanity's deepest tools. It gave warmth, protection, light, and food. But here is the detail that matters for barbecue. Fire was not just flame, fire was management. You needed to understand wood. You needed to understand embers. You needed to know that a leaping fire could burn meat outside while leaving it raw inside. But a bed of coals could cook slowly, evenly, quietly. You needed patience, attention, and an intimate relationship with heat. No thermostat, no timer, no metal grill bought from a store, just sight, smell, sound, and experience. The first barbecue was probably not called barbecue. It was not sauced, it was not plated. Nobody argued over whether it belonged to Texas, Memphis, Kansas City, or the Carolinas. Mostly because none of those places existed yet in the human imagination. It was simply meat cooked near smoke, above coals, beside ash, or inside earth. Earth ovens appear in many ancient cultures, and this is where the story begins to feel strangely familiar. In one place, people dug pits, heated stones, wrapped meat or roots in leaves, buried everything, and waited. In another, they built frames over low fires and let smoke do its slow work. In another, they suspended meat near flames to dry and preserve it for travel. Different continents, different languages, same problem. How do you turn a perishable animal into food that can feed people safely, slowly, and sometimes for days? The answer was smoke. Smoke is one of those things you may think of as flavor now. But for early people, it was also protection. It dried the surface of meat. It discouraged insects. It carried compounds from burning wood that slowed spoilage. It marked time. It marked place. Hickory, oak, mesquite, fruitwoods, palm, mangrove. Whatever grew nearby became part of the meal, long before regional barbecue maps existed. Geography was already entering the food through the smoke itself. This is where the American story has to begin carefully, because barbecue is often treated as if it appeared suddenly in the South, fully formed, wearing a check tablecloth. It did not. Long before Europeans arrived in the Caribbean or mainland North America, indigenous peoples throughout the Americas had developed sophisticated ways of cooking, smoking, drying, and preserving food. They cooked fish, shellfish, birds, deer, turtles, alligators, maize, squash, beans, roots, and peppers. Some cooked on wooden frames, some used pits, some smoked foods for storage, some roasted communally for ceremony, diplomacy, and survival. They did not know the word genetics when they bred crops. They did not know the modern language of food safety when they preserved meat. They were doing it anyway. In the Caribbean, especially among Taino communities of the Greater Antilles, Spanish observers would later describe raised wooden frameworks used over fire. Those reports are filtered through colonial eyes, and you should be cautious with them, because conquerors often misunderstood the peoples they were describing. But the basic technology is clear enough. A wooden structure, green enough not to burn quickly, held food above heat and smoke. Fish could dry there, meat could cook there. Food could be kept away from animals and ash. Simple, brilliant, durable. And no, it was not simple because the people were simple. It was simple because the solution was elegant. Across the southeastern woodlands of what is now the United States, native nations also used fire with extraordinary sophistication. They burned landscapes deliberately to manage forests, encourage game, clear undergrowth, and shape ecosystems. Fire was not only a cooking tool, it was an environmental tool, a political tool, a seasonal rhythm. You have to understand that context to see why barbecue, as later, could become more than a recipe in indigenous America. Food and fire already belonged to community, territory, ceremony, and power. Then came pigs, ships, disease, conquest, and language, but not yet. For now, stay with the older scene. Imagine a humid coastline before European maps have renamed it. The air is thick with salt and insects. A low fire breathes beneath a wooden rack. Fish skins tighten in the heat. Fat drops and hisses on the coals. Smoke moves slowly through leaves, through hair, through woven shelters, through a village that knows exactly how long food takes, because generations have watched the same signs. The crackle, the scent, the colour, the quiet shift from raw to cooked. This was not American barbecue yet. It was older than America, older than the argument, older than the source. Smoke came first. The smoke was already there before the word arrived. That matters, because food history often gets tangled in language. A word appears in a European document, and suddenly people begin to act as if the practice itself was born on that page. It was not. The page only tells you when someone with ink, paper, power, and a habit of naming other people's worlds, finally noticed what had been in front of him. In the early 1500s, Spanish ships moved through the Caribbean with priests, soldiers, scribes, interpreters, enslaved Africans, horses, pigs, iron weapons, and diseases that would devastate indigenous communities on a scale almost impossible to sit with calmly. Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the smaller islands were not empty places waiting for history. They were dense with villages, farms, trade routes, fishing grounds, languages, ceremonies, and political life. The Taino and other indigenous peoples of the region had their own technologies, their own food systems, their own names for things. Then the Spanish arrived and began writing them down badly. Here is where the word enters the story. Spanish observers recorded something that sounded to them like barbacoa. In some accounts, it referred to a raised wooden framework. In others, it meant a sleeping platform, a storage rack, or a structure used for cooking and drying food. That confusion is important. Barbacoa was not originally just a meal in the way a modern restaurant menu might suggest. It was a piece of technology, a platform, a frame, a way to use air, height, smoke, and heat. Think about that for a second. The first European version of barbecue was not a sauce. It was not a cut of meat. It was not even necessarily a feast. It was a structure. One of the best-known early writers to describe Caribbean life was Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, a Spanish chronicler who spent years in the Americas and published accounts in the 16th century. Oviedo described indigenous practices with a mixture of observation, condescension, fascination, and colonial blindness. He noticed what people ate. He noticed how they slept. He noticed how food was prepared. But he did not see these societies as equal civilizations. He saw them through the framework of empire. And empire has a way of turning intelligence into scenery. That is the uncomfortable reality at the beginning of barbecue's written history. The technique was indigenous. The record was colonial. The word survived. But the people who gave it meaning were being conquered. By the time Spanish writers were using barbacoa, the Caribbean had already become one of the most violent laboratories of European expansion. Columbus had reached the region in 1492. Within decades, forced labor, warfare, enslavement, and disease had shattered Taino populations. Scholars debate exact numbers because pre-contact population estimates vary widely, but many historians agree that the collapse was catastrophic. Communities that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more across the Greater Antilles, were reduced with horrifying speed, not slowly, not gently, catastrophically. And through that catastrophe, Spanish writers borrowed words. Barbacoa was one of many. Hammock comes from a Taino word. Canoe comes through indigenous Caribbean languages. Tobacco does too. These words entered European languages because Europeans entered indigenous worlds and took what they found useful. Boats, beds, smoke, plants, food, names. It was not just conquest by sword. It was conquest by vocabulary. Here is the twist. The borrowed word travelled farther than the people who first used it were allowed to survive in peace. Spanish speakers carried barbacoa into colonial settlements. The term moved through ports, plantations, ranching zones, and military outposts. It changed as it travelled. Because words always do, in Mexico, barbacoa developed into a particular tradition of pit-cooking meat, often wrapped and cooked slowly underground. In the Caribbean, it could still suggest wooden racks and smoke. in English. Over time it became barbecue, barbecue, BBQ, and eventually a whole cultural argument squeezed into 3 letters. 3 letters. B, BQ. That is almost absurd when you step back from it. A word that began in indigenous Caribbean technology now appears on neon signs, sauce bottles, football commercials, competition banners, backyard aprons, and airport restaurants promising regional authenticity between gate changes. The distance between those worlds is enormous, but the line is there. This is why etymology is not just a cute aside. The origin of the word tells you something about the origin of the power imbalance. Europeans did not invent the method, but they recorded it, renamed it, adapted it, and eventually claimed it as part of their own colonial foodways. Later Americans would do something similar on a national scale. They would take indigenous fire knowledge, African labour and seasoning, European livestock, Caribbean vocabulary, and regional agriculture. Then call the result tradition. And it was tradition, but it was not simple. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains almost everything that comes later. Barbecue was portable, not in the sense that you could pack it into a lunchbox, but in the sense that the method moved well. You did not need a palace kitchen. You did not need an oven made of brick. You did not need refined equipment. You needed meat, wood, time, and people who understood heat. That made it perfect for colonies, plantations, armies, cattle ranges, church gatherings, political rallies, and roadside businesses. No silverware required, no dining room required, no equality required either, and that last part is where the story will eventually darken. For Spanish colonists, cooking over frames and pits was practical in a hot climate, where meat spoiled fast and fuel sources varied by island and region. For indigenous communities, these methods were already part of broader life. For enslaved Africans who would soon be forced into the Americas in growing numbers, open fire cooking also met existing traditions of smoke, spice, communal labour, and improvisation. Over time, these worlds collided around the fire, but in the early colonial Caribbean, the fire was not yet the friendly symbol it would become in American advertising. It existed inside a landscape of extraction. Sugar plantations were beginning to spread, cattle and pigs multiplied, European empires fought over islands, ports filled with ships, smoke rose from cooking fires, from cleared forests, from burned villages, from boiling houses, from the machinery of conquest. This was not just the birth of a food word. It was the birth of a colonial system that would carry that word into blood. Labour, hunger, celebration, and profit. So when you hear barbecue today, you may think of a picnic table, a smoker, a summer afternoon, or an argument about sauce. Fair enough. That is part of the story too. But underneath that familiar word is an older sound, carried from the Caribbean into Spanish, from Spanish into English, and from English into 1,000 roadside signs. Barbacoa, a borrowed word from a wounded world. By the time English colonists began trying to survive along the Atlantic coast of North America, the word had already crossed an ocean of meaning, but the practice was still changing. In the 1600s, the English settlements at Jamestown, the Carolina coast, and the wider Chesapeake were not comfortable little villages waiting to become America. They were fragile, hungry, often violent experiments built on borrowed land, unstable supplies, dangerous weather, and a constant struggle to turn unfamiliar environments into food. You have to strip away the later paintings for a moment. No polished founding myth, no neat wooden table, no glowing hearth in a tidy cabin. Mud, mosquitoes, rot, smoke. Food was one of the first crises of colonization. English settlers arrived with European expectations, European farming habits, and European livestock. But they entered landscapes already shaped by indigenous agriculture, hunting, fishing, and controlled burning. The colonists often depended on native knowledge while also attacking native sovereignty. That contradiction sits at the heart of early American food history. They needed help to survive, and they wanted land to expand. Both were true. Pigs became one of the most important animals in this new world of fire and hunger. Spanish expeditions had already brought pigs into parts of the Americas in the 1500s, and English colonists later relied on them heavily. Pigs were useful because they were almost insultingly efficient. They could forage in woods, they reproduced quickly, they ate acorns, roots, scraps, and whatever else they could find. They did not require the careful pasture management that cattle often did. Left loose, they could turn forest into meat. That sounds convenient, it was also destructive. Free-ranging hogs damaged indigenous cornfields, disrupted ecosystems, and became another source of conflict between native communities and European settlers. What looked like abundance to colonists could look like invasion to the people whose land was being rooted up by tusks and hooves. A pig was not just a pig. It was a moving claim on the landscape. Still, for hungry settlers, pork became essential. It could be salted, it could be smoked, it could be roasted whole. It could feed a household, a work crew, a militia gathering, or a political crowd. In a world without refrigeration, this was not a luxury. It was the difference between surviving a season and watching food spoil in the heat. Here is the detail that makes barbecue different from ordinary roasting. Slow cooking made tough meat useful. Whole animals could be cooked in pits or over coals for large groups, and the parts that elite diners might dismiss could become tender with enough smoke. Moisture, time, and skill. This was not fine dining, it was practical engineering. Heat entered slowly, fat rendered, collagen softened, smoke clung to the surface, people waited. Waiting was part of the method. Early colonial barbecue was not yet divided into the famous regional categories you know now. There was no Kansas City burnt end, no Texas brisket mythology, no Memphis rib competition, no Carolina sauce war carefully printed on a tourist map. There was pork cooked outdoors, there were communal meals, there were borrowed techniques, local woods, indigenous precedents, African knowledge, European animals, and the practical needs of settlement, and then there was alcohol. Colonial barbecues were often public, messy, and political. They were not always peaceful family gatherings. In Virginia and the Carolinas, outdoor feasts could accompany militia musters, court days, elections, weddings, church events, and harvest celebrations. They brought people together, but not equally. White planters, poorer white farmers, enslaved people, free black people, native people, servants, officials, candidates, and labourers could all be present around the same event. But the meaning of the event depended entirely on where you stood. If you were a landowner, the barbecue might display generosity. If you were a candidate, it might buy loyalty. If you were poor, it might be one of the few times meat appeared in abundance. If you were enslaved, you might be cooking the food, cutting the wood, tending the pit, carrying the water, and cleaning up after everyone else had eaten. This was not community in the simple nostalgic sense. It was hierarchy with smoke over it. The English learned quickly that feeding people could move people. A whole hog on a pit had power. It smelled before it was seen. It gathered bodies before speeches began. It promised fullness in a world where fullness was not guaranteed. You can imagine the scene on a humid colonial afternoon. The ground damp beneath boots, the air sweet and greasy with rendering fat, flies worrying at barrels of drink, men arguing over land, taxes, militia service and tobacco prices, while somewhere nearby a pitmaster watched the coals more carefully than any politician watched his words. That pitmaster may have been enslaved. Often he was. But before the darkest part of the story comes fully into view, you need to understand the exchange of techniques that created the food itself. Indigenous people had long used smoke, frames, pits, maize dishes, peppers, and seasonal gatherings. West and Central Africans brought deep traditions of open-fire cooking, spice, stews, rice cultivation, and communal food labour. Europeans brought pigs, cattle, iron pots, vinegar habits, and a hunger for land and profit. None of these streams alone made what later became Southern barbecue. The mixture did. A rough mixture, a forced mixture, a brilliant mixture. This is why barbecue feels both local and global, even in its colonial form. It was never just one people's invention. It was contact food, border food, plantation food, survival food. It was made in places where languages collided and power was unequal. It absorbed pepper, vinegar, pork fat, smoke, cornbread, greens, molasses, and labour. It absorbed violence too. The word barbecue began appearing in English-language writing by the late 1600s and early 1700s. Though spelling wandered wildly because spelling did that sort of thing before dictionaries became everyone's school teacher, barbecue could describe the wooden frame, the cooking method, the meal, or the social event. The meaning expanded because the event expanded. It was no longer only about how meat met smoke. It was about who gathered, who served, who paid, who profited, and who was excluded. By the 18th century, in parts of Virginia and the Carolinas, barbecue was becoming recognizable as a public feast. Hogs were slaughtered, pits were dug, wood was burned down to coals, meat cooked for hours, crowds formed, drink flowed, deals were made, toasts were offered, arguments began. Probably more than a few people woke up the next morning regretting the quantity of rum involved. A very old American tradition, apparently, but beneath the humour is something more important. Barbecue became a way to turn meat into belonging. To eat from the same animal suggested fellowship, even when the society around it denied fellowship to most of the people who made the meal possible. It was generous and coercive, warm and brutal, local and imperial, ordinary and symbolic. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because once barbecue became a crowd food, it became a political tool. Once it became a political tool, it became a stage. And once it became a stage, every hog, every pit, every speech, every election, and every public feast could carry a message about who belonged in the new colonial order. The fire was no longer just cooking meat. It was cooking power. By the 18th century, barbecue had learned how to gather a crowd. That may sound like a small development, but it changed everything. A cooking technique can stay in a household for centuries and remain private. Ordinary, almost invisible. A public feast is different. A public feast announces itself. It smells down the road. It requires labour, planning, animals, firewood, drink, invitation, and display. It creates a temporary world around the pit, and for a few hours, everyone can see who has power, who wants power, who serves power, and who is expected to applaud. In colonial Virginia, the Carolinas, and parts of the wider South, barbecue became one of the greatest outdoor rituals of public life. It appeared at militia musters, court days, church gatherings, harvest celebrations, horse races, Independence Day, events, and election campaigns. It was food, yes, but it was also theatre. You did not simply cook a pig, you staged generosity. Here is the thing about generosity in a hierarchical society. It is rarely innocent. A wealthy planter could host a barbecue and present himself as a benevolent patriarch, the kind of man who fed neighbours, dependents, workers, voters, and guests. A political candidate could provide meat and liquor before asking for support. A local leader could use a feast to remind everyone that abundance flowed through him. The message was not subtle. Look at what I can provide. Look at who gathers when I call. Look at the smoke rising from my land. This was not just hospitality, it was influence. Think about the mechanics. A whole hog could feed many people. Several hogs could feed a county gathering. Add cornbread, stewed vegetables, cider, rum, whiskey, and maybe music. And suddenly you had more than a meal. You had a campaign event before campaign events looked modern. You had a town hall with grease on its fingers. You had a political advertisement made of meat, and people came. Of course they came. In a world where many households lived close to hunger, a public barbecue offered something powerful. Meat in abundance, drink in abundance, company in abundance. Even if the speeches were dull, the smell was not. Slow-cooked pork has always understood publicity better than most politicians. The 18th century barbecue could be rowdy. Accounts from the period describe public feasts tied to elections and celebrations, where alcohol flowed freely and crowds became noisy. The scene was not the tidy backyard cookout of later suburban America. It was louder, rougher, more masculine in public presentation, and often deeply tied to local power. Men gave toasts, candidates shook hands, news travelled, arguments began, deals were whispered, children watched, dogs waited too close to the bones, somewhere behind the central display. Cooks tended the pits for hours. Pay attention to the labour. The host received the praise, but the host usually did not stand through the night managing coals. The skill belonged to the people who prepared the animal, dug the pit, selected the wood, controlled the heat, basted the meat, lifted heavy carcasses, and knew by touch and smell when the pork was done. In many southern settings, especially on plantations, the labour was performed by enslaved black cooks. So the barbecue carried a contradiction from the beginning. It promised community while depending on bondage. It praised abundance while hiding coercion. It created a feeling of shared belonging for some people through the labour of people who were not free. That contradiction did not weaken the ritual, it powered it. Barbecue also became attached to early American ideas of Republican simplicity. After independence, many Americans liked to contrast themselves with European aristocrats. They imagined themselves as plain, hearty, rural, virtuous people, not powdered courtiers eating delicate dishes under chandeliers. Outdoor feasts fit that self-image beautifully. Barbecue seemed rustic. It seemed democratic. It seemed local and masculine and free. But here is the twist. The same meal could be called democratic while taking place in a society built on exclusion. Enslaved people cooked it. Women often helped produce the surrounding food and domestic labor, but were kept away from formal political authority. Native land had been seized or pressured away. Poor white men might be welcomed as voters in some settings and ignored in others. The feast looked open, but the political world around it was tightly guarded. This was not democracy in its full modern meaning. It was democracy for a chosen circle, perfumed with smoke. By the early Republic, barbecue had become a patriotic language. Public barbecues marked the 4th of July. They celebrated military victories. They honored candidates and visiting dignitaries. They could be used to declare loyalty to a party, a region, or a cause. The food made politics physical. You did not only hear a speech about liberty, you chewed it, swallowed it, washed it down, and remembered who paid for it. There is something almost modern about that. Today, campaigns by television ads, social media spots, branded hats, stadium rallies, and carefully staged photo opportunities. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a candidate might offer a roasted ox, a hogshead of drink, a public table, and enough spectacle to keep his name in people's mouths. Literally. And barbecue was very good at staying in people's mouths. The word itself expanded again. Barbecue could mean the food. It could mean the method. It could mean the gathering. You could go to a barbecue, eat barbecue, and barbecue a hog, all in the same breath. That flexibility mattered because the practice was becoming a social institution. It was not locked inside a recipe. It moved through occasions. In some places, the animal at the center was a pig. In others, cattle, sheep, or goats might appear. The exact preparation varied by region, wealth, available livestock, and local taste. Sauces were not yet the standardized badges of identity they would later become, but seasonings, vinegar, peppers, and fats were already shaping local preferences. What mattered most was the combination of outdoor cooking, slow heat, public gathering, and social purpose. Barbecue had become a way to feed a crowd and define a crowd, and because crowds mattered in American politics, barbecue mattered too. It helped bind neighbors. It helped politicians perform closeness. It helped churches raise funds and communities mark time. It helped elites display command over land, animals, labor, and hospitality. It could make a hard world feel briefly abundant. It could also make an unjust world feel normal. That is the uncomfortable genius of ritual. It does not merely reflect society. It teaches people how to accept society. You can almost see one of these gatherings at dusk, the last light fading through trees, smoke hanging low over a field, men clustered around barrels and benches, a speaker raising his voice, children licking grease from their fingers, enslaved cooks moving in and out of the firelight, essential and unnamed, the pig reduced to bones, the crowd full, warmed, persuaded, perhaps a little drunk, and ready to remember the day as fellowship, but fellowship for whom? That question never left the smoke. The person most responsible for the barbecue was often the person least likely to be remembered by name. That is not an accident. It is one of the oldest tricks in food history. A dish becomes famous. A region claims it. A family recipe is praised. A white host is celebrated for generosity, taste, and tradition. Meanwhile, the hands that cut the wood, cleaned the animal, built the fire, watched the coals, seasoned the meat, and stayed awake through the hottest hours vanish into the background. In the Southern barbecue story, many of those hands were enslaved. This is the part that should make you stop and sit with the smoke differently. Barbecue did not merely happen near slavery. It grew inside a slave society. It was cooked on plantations, at political gatherings, at public celebrations, at militia musters, and at private feasts where enslaved people performed the labor that made white abundance visible. The host stood in the center of the ritual. The pitmaster stood near the fire, and the fire was work. A whole hog did not cook itself. First came slaughter, a hard and bloody task that demanded strength, speed, and experience. Then came scalding or scraping, cleaning, splitting, salting, seasoning, and preparing the carcass. Someone had to gather or cut wood. And not just any wood. Green wood smoked differently from seasoned wood. Oak was not hickory. Hickory was not pine. A careless choice could ruin the meat or poison the flavor. Someone had to burn wood down into coals, not flames, because flame was violence and coals were control. Control was everything. The pit had to be watched for hours, sometimes through the night, too hot, and the outside blackened before the inside softened, too cool, and the meat sat too long in danger, too dry, and the flesh tightened, too wet, and the smoke lost its grip. A skilled cook learned by smell, by sound, by the way fat dripped and hissed, by the colour of the skin, by the resistance of meat under a knife. No digital thermometer, no insulated smoker, no stainless steel probe, just attention. Attention for hour after hour after hour. That knowledge was expertise. Even when the law refused to call the expert a person in full possession of himself or herself. Enslaved cooks became masters of heat because they had to be. They understood smoke the way a blacksmith understood metal, or a sailor understood wind. Yet plantation records, when they mention them at all, often reduce them to first names, roles or property values, cook, driver, boy, woman, hand. Not chef, not artisan, not founder. Here is the uncomfortable reality. Southern barbecue owes an enormous debt to black labor, black skill, and black food knowledge. That debt was not politely borrowed. Much of it was extracted under force. The influence came from several directions at once. West and Central African foodways carried deep experience with open-fire cooking. Peppers, stews, rice, greens, and communal preparation. Enslaved Africans and their descendants adapted under brutal conditions, using what was available, stretching small amounts of meat, building flavor from smoke, fat, vinegar, pepper, salt, and patience. Indigenous techniques of smoking and pit cooking remained part of the larger landscape. European livestock, especially pigs, supplied the animal most associated with early southern barbecue. The result was not a pure inheritance from one source. It was a forced convergence. And forced is the word that matters. Do not let the warmth of barbecue soften the violence around it. On plantations, enslaved people lived under a system built on sale, punishment, surveillance, family separation, and stolen labor. Their food rations were often limited and monotonous, commonly based around cornmeal, salted pork, and whatever could be grown. Gathered, hunted, or traded in small margins of time. Skilled cooks might prepare elaborate meals for enslavers, while their own families lived under scarcity. Think about that for a second. A person could spend the day making abundance for someone else, then return to a cabin where abundance was not available. That was not irony, that was domination. Barbecue feasts intensified the contradiction. They displayed plenty in a world where plenty had been created by people denied ownership of their own bodies. When a planter fed a crowd from a pit tended by enslaved cooks, he was not only showing that he possessed land and animals, he was showing that he possessed labor. The slow-cooked hog became a public symbol of private power. The meat said, "Look what I can give." The silence around the pit said, "Look what I can command." Some enslaved cooks became locally famous. Though fame did not mean freedom, their skill could be praised by the very people who claimed ownership over them. They were trusted with expensive provisions, dangerous fires, public meals, and the reputation of the household. That trust did not make the system gentler, it made the contradiction sharper. A man could be admired for his barbecue and still be sold. A woman could be indispensable in the kitchen and still be whipped. Talent did not protect people from slavery. Talent often made their exploitation more profitable. This was not apprenticeship, it was captivity. After emancipation, those skills did not disappear. Freed people carried barbecue knowledge into towns, churchyards, markets, rail depots, political gatherings, and eventually restaurants. Black pitmasters became essential to the growth of commercial barbecue across the South and beyond. They cooked for emancipation celebrations, Juneteenth gatherings, church fundraisers, labor meetings, neighborhood suppers, and white customers who often still refused to see black expertise as the foundation of the food they loved. The old pattern continued in a new form. The cook was needed, the cook was praised, the cook was not always credited, and yet, black barbecue traditions also became sources of independence, entrepreneurship, memory, and community after slavery. Food businesses offered some black cooks a path, narrow and often dangerous, toward income and recognition. A pit beside a road could become a livelihood. A church barbecue could fund a school. A holiday cookout could turn survival into celebration. Smoke could carry grief, but it could also carry defiance. That is why this chapter cannot end only in theft. It also has to end in endurance. Because despite everything, enslaved and later free black cooks shaped the flavor, the method, the social life, and the commercial future of American barbecue. They built traditions that others would claim, package, sanitize, and sell. They made food that survived the plantation, survived Reconstruction terror, survived segregation, survived erasure, and still sits at the center of America's most passionate regional arguments. The next time you see smoke rising from a pit, remember that it is not just appetite in the air, it is labor, it is knowledge, it is history made edible, it is the name missing from the sign, the hand missing from the photograph, the person standing beside the fire while someone else takes the bow. Barbecue was not just born in celebration, it was born in bondage too. War did not extinguish the barbecue fire, it scattered it. When the American Civil War began in 1861, the South was already a region where barbecue had become deeply tied to public life, politics, plantation display, and local identity. Men gathered around pits before elections. Militias ate from them. Churches raised money with them. Enslavers staged abundance with them. Enslaved cooks made them possible. So when armies formed, farms emptied, railroads strained, and families watched sons march away. Barbecue did not simply disappear from the landscape. It followed the upheaval. Not neatly, not romantically, not as a comforting picnic beside a battlefield. It followed in hunger, scarcity, smoke, and memory. You have to understand the scale of disruption first. Roughly 750,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. A number so large that it remains one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. 750,000. Farms were stripped. Livestock was taken by armies or hidden from them. Rail lines were destroyed. Salt became precious. Corn became uncertain. Pork, once a foundation of Southern food, became harder to secure in many places as the war dragged on. A whole hog barbecue, once a sign of public plenty, could become impossible where animals had been requisitioned, stolen, slaughtered, or simply never raised because labour and feed had vanished into war. The smell of smoke changed. Before the war, smoke from a pit might announce a feast. During the war, smoke might mean a campfire, a burned depot, a ruined barn, a battlefield cooking line, or a town set aflame. The sensory world of the South shifted from celebration to emergency. Wet wool, burned powder, salt pork frying in iron pans, cornmeal boiled into something barely filling, coffee stretched, replaced, or gone. Men dreamed of home food with a hunger that was not just physical. They dreamed of meals that proved the world had once been stable. Barbecue belonged to that lost stability. Soldiers wrote often about food. Because soldiers always do, they complained about rations, traded for better meals, foraged when supply failed, and celebrated any occasion when fresh meat appeared. A roasted pig or beef cooked over a fire could become a brief festival inside hardship. It did not erase the war. It marked the depth of deprivation around it. The rarer the abundance, the more powerful the meal. This was not nostalgia yet. It was relief. Meanwhile, on the home front, barbecue retained political meaning. Confederate rallies, musters, and public gatherings still used food when they could. Feasts helped recruit men, raise morale, and perform unity. But the old world was cracking. The labour system that had sustained plantation barbecues was under direct assault, not only by Union armies but by enslaved people themselves, who fled, resisted, negotiated, withheld labour, gathered intelligence, and turned war into an opening for freedom. The fire was still burning, but the society around it was coming apart. Then came emancipation, and the meaning of public gathering changed again. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in rebelling states to be free, though its immediate reach depended on Union military power. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. Those dates were legal milestones, but freedom on the ground arrived unevenly, dangerously, and often through the actions of black people who seized the chance to move, reunite families, build churches, found schools, work for wages, and claim public life. Public meals became part of that claim. After the war, barbecue appeared at emancipation celebrations, political meetings, church events, and community gatherings. Juneteenth, rooted in the announcement of freedom in Texas on June 19, 1865, often involved shared food, outdoor gatherings, music, speeches, and barbecue. The meal that had once helped display enslavers' authority could now help mark black survival and freedom. Think about that for a second. the same form of cooking, the same smoke, the same patient heat, but a different public meaning, not ownership, freedom, not plantation display, community memory, not a host showing command over enslaved labor, a people gathering to say they had endured. That transformation matters, and it was not easy. Reconstruction, from 1865 into the 1870s, was a period of extraordinary possibility and vicious backlash. Black men entered politics, schools opened, churches became centers of organizing. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights. Barbecues and public feasts became places where candidates spoke, communities mobilized, and freed people participated in civic life with an openness that would have been unthinkable under slavery. And white supremacists understood the danger. Public black political life threatened the old order, and food gatherings could become targets. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups used intimidation, arson, assault, and murder to crush black freedom and Republican politics across the South. A barbecue could be joyful, but it could also be watched. A rally could feed people, but it could also expose them. The smoke that gathered a crowd could also identify a crowd. Here is the part that does not fit the postcard version of barbecue. After the Civil War, barbecue was not simply a symbol of Southern unity, it was contested ground. White Democrats used barbecues to rebuild political power and promote a mythology of reunion that often erased slavery as the central cause of the war. Black communities used barbecues to celebrate emancipation, organize voters, raise funds, and affirm kinship. The same food could serve opposite memories. That is why barbecue after the war became so emotionally loaded. It could remember freedom, or it could disguise defeat. It could build solidarity among the formerly enslaved, or it could help former Confederates perform local loyalty. It could feed people at a church picnic, or it could soften a political message that deserved sharper scrutiny. It could be sincere, it could be manipulative. Often it was both. By the late 19th century, as Reconstruction was violently dismantled and Jim Crow laws hardened, barbecue remained one of the few public spaces where black skill was undeniable, even when black rights were denied. Black cooks continued to feed crowds across racial lines, sometimes as wage laborers, sometimes as entrepreneurs, sometimes in deeply unequal arrangements that echoed older forms of dependency. The pitmaster could be central to the event and still excluded from the power the event created. That old contradiction survived the war, but something else survived too: technique, memory, adaptation. Barbecue moved with people leaving plantations, moving into towns, working on railroads, building businesses, serving church communities, and creating holiday traditions. The ruined plantation feast did not vanish. It split apart and reformed. Some of it became white nostalgia. Some of it became black celebration. Some of it became commercial opportunity. Some of it became family ritual. This decision seemed small at the time. The decision to keep gathering, keep cooking, keep feeding people under trees, in fields, beside churches, near depots, along roads. It was not, because after the Civil War, barbecue became one of the ways Americans argued over what the war had meant. Not always in speeches, sometimes in silence, sometimes in who was invited, sometimes in who cooked, sometimes in what holiday was being marked, sometimes in whether the flag beside the pit represented liberation or the refusal to let an old order die. The meat was tender, the memory was not. Halfway across the country, the smoke found a crossroads. Kansas City did not become a barbecue capital because one person woke up with a perfect sauce recipe and a dream. Food legends like that are tidy, and history is usually not tidy. Kansas City became Kansas City because animals, railroads, migration, labor, segregation, business, and appetite all converged in one place at the right moment. It was geography turned edible. Look at the map in your mind. The Missouri River bends through the city. Rail lines spread outward like metal veins. Cattle and hogs move from farms and ranches towards stockyards. Workers move too, from the rural South, from small towns, from black communities seeking wages and possibility, from immigrant neighborhoods trying to build a life in a growing city. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Kansas City sat at a junction of livestock, transportation, and hunger. That sounds practical. It was explosive. The Kansas City stockyards opened in the 1870s and grew into one of the largest livestock markets in the United States. By the early 20th century, millions of animals passed through the yards in busy years. Millions. Cattle, hogs, and sheep arrived by rail, were bought, sold, slaughtered, packed, shipped, cooked, and eaten. The city smelled of manure, blood, smoke, river damp, coal soot, and money. Not polite money, industrial money, money made in hides, hooves, fat, freight charges, packing plants, and long hours on killing floors. Barbecue thrived in that world because the city had meat everywhere. But here is the detail that explains Kansas City barbecue. It did not limit itself to one animal. In older southern pork regions, the pig dominated. In central Texas, beef would become king. Kansas City looked around at the stockyards and said, essentially, yes, beef, pork, ribs, sausage, ham, turkey, chicken, burnt ends, whatever the packing houses, markets, and butchers could supply. If it could take smoke, Kansas City would try it. No purity test, no single sacred cut, variety. And then came the people who turned variety into identity. One of the central figures in the Kansas City story was Henry Perry, often called the father of Kansas City barbecue. Perry was born in Tennessee in the 19th century and eventually made his way to Kansas City, where he began selling smoked meats in the early 20th century. The details of his earliest operation vary in different tellings, but the general picture is vivid. He sold barbecue from a stand in the city's black community, serving meat wrapped in newspaper, sometimes from an alley location, to workers who wanted something filling, smoky, affordable, and immediate. Think about that scene for a second. Not a polished dining room, not a lifestyle brand, a working city, hungry laborers, meat wrapped in paper, smoke rising near brick buildings, people eating with their hands because the food did not need ceremony, it needed flavor. Perry's sauce was reportedly sharp, peppery, and not the sweet, thick supermarket style many people now associate with Kansas City. That matters because barbecue traditions are not frozen at birth, they evolve. A sauce can become sweeter over time as sugar, molasses, tomato, bottled condiments, and commercial tastes reshape expectations. What later becomes classic may not be exactly what the founder served. Memory edits recipes the way it edits everything else. Perry trained and influenced people who would carry Kansas City barbecue forward. Two names matter, especially Charlie Bryant and Arthur Bryant. Charlie Bryant worked with Perry. and after Perry's death in 1940. The business eventually came under the control of Charlie and then Arthur Bryant. Arthur Bryant's Barbecue became one of the most famous barbecue restaurants in America, praised by presidents, celebrities, sports writers, and ordinary diners willing to stand in line for smoked meat and sauce. But the story does not belong only to famous names. Kansas City barbecue was built in black neighborhoods, especially around the 18th and Vine district, a center of black culture, jazz, business, and nightlife. This was a city shaped by segregation, but segregation did not prevent creativity. It concentrated it under pressure. Black entrepreneurs opened restaurants, clubs, shops, and service businesses in spaces where white-owned institutions excluded them or exploited them. Barbecue joints fed musicians after late sets, workers after long shifts, families after church, travelers, gamblers, cab drivers, and anyone who followed the smell. The soundscape matters here. Kansas City was not just smoke, it was jazz, trumpets, pianos, drums, voices, trains, streetcars, laughter, cash registers, knives striking cutting boards, sauce ladled onto meat. Barbecue and jazz shared a neighborhood rhythm. Both were improvisational but disciplined. Both had deep southern roots but became urban in Kansas City. Both could look casual to outsiders while requiring enormous skill. That is not a stretch, it is the city. Another Kansas City landmark emerged through the Gates family. Gates Bar-B-Q, founded in the mid-20th century, helped create another branch of the city's barbecue identity. Famous for its greeting, its sauce, and its scale. Together, places like Arthur Bryant's, Gates, and later many others transformed Kansas City barbecue from local sustenance into civic mythology. The city began to know itself through smoke, and here is where rivalry starts sharpening. Kansas City's strength was also what made purists suspicious. If you're from a whole hog Carolina tradition, Kansas City might seem too broad. If you're from Texas, the heavy sauce might feel like hiding the meat. If you are from Memphis, the sauced ribs might invite comparison with dry rub. Kansas City answered with abundance. It didn't whisper, it piled the tray. Burnt ends became one of the city's great signatures. Originally, these were fatty, irregular pieces cut from the point end of a smoked brisket, sometimes treated as scraps, sometimes given away or sold cheaply. Over time, they became prized. That is one of barbecue's great reversals. The overlooked piece becomes the luxury. The edge becomes the center. The scrap becomes the reason people drive across town. It worked. By the late 20th century, Kansas City had built one of the largest barbecue identities in the country, with restaurants, competitions, sauce brands, and civic pride wrapped around the image of slow smoke. The American Royal World Series of Barbecue, connected to the city's larger livestock and agricultural heritage, helped turn competition barbecue into spectacle. Teams arrived with smokers, rubs, secret recipes, matching shirts, and the calm intensity of people who have very strong opinions about pork shoulder. Very strong opinions. The joke is easy, but the stakes are real in cultural terms. Kansas City barbecue tells a story about migration, black entrepreneurship, industrial meat, and urban identity. It shows how barbecue moved from plantation fields and courthouse gatherings into commercial restaurants and national fame. It also shows how a food born from forced labour and unequal power could become, in the hands of black business owners and cooks, a means of survival, artistry, and local authority. This was not backyard nostalgia, it was city building. A plate of Kansas City barbecue can hold ribs, brisket, sausage, pulled pork, fries, beans, white bread, pickles, and sauce thick enough to shine under fluorescent light. It can look excessive, because it is. But excess is part of the point. The city became a crossroads, and the plate became a crossroads too. Pork from one tradition, beef from another, sauce from another, smoke from everywhere. Kansas City did not choose one lane. It built an intersection and made the whole country smell it. Meanwhile, farther south and west, the smoke changed animals. In Texas, barbecue became inseparable from beef, and that did not happen by accident. It happened because of land, cattle, immigration, railroads, markets, and memory. If Kansas City was the crossroads where every kind of meat could meet the smoker, Texas became the place where one animal grew into a monument. Not just dinner, identity. You have to start with the landscape. Texas was vast, dry in some regions, lush in others, and shaped by indigenous nations, Spanish colonization, Mexican ranching traditions, Anglo settlement, and violent conflict over land. Long before Texas became part of the United States, cattle already mattered there. Spanish colonists and missionaries brought cattle into the region, and over generations. Ranching culture developed across northern Mexico and Texas. Vaqueros managed herds, rode long distances, handled ropes, branded animals, and built a cattle world that later Anglo-cowboy mythology would borrow from heavily, while often forgetting where much of it came from. Even the word rodeo comes from Spanish. That matters because Texas barbecue did not emerge from a blank prairie. It grew out of overlapping food traditions, Mexican barbacoa, indigenous cooking, southern pit cooking, immigrant meat markets, cattle drives, and butcher shops. Some of those traditions used pits, some used direct fire, some used smokehouses, some cooked heads, shoulders, ribs, sausages, and tough cuts slowly because slow cooking was how you made stubborn meat surrender. Surrender is the right word. Brisket, the cut that now sits like a smoked crown jewel in Central Texas barbecue, comes from the lower chest of the animal. It is muscular, tough, and packed with connective tissue because cattle use those muscles constantly. Cook it quickly, and it can punish you. Cook it slowly, with heat, smoke, salt, time, and discipline, and it becomes something else entirely. Tender, fatty, fragrant, almost ceremonial. But brisket was not always the sacred object it is now. For much of its history, it was a practical cut. The kind of meat butchers, working families, and patient cooks could use because it rewarded technique more than wealth. That is one of barbecue's recurring tricks. It turns difficulty into prestige. It takes the part that demands the most care and makes it the test of mastery. By the late 19th century, German and Czech immigrants had become especially important in Central Texas food culture. Many settled in towns such as Lockhart, Taylor, Elgin, and Luling, bringing traditions of sausage making, butchery, smoking, and meat markets. These were not restaurants in the modern sense at first. They were markets. You bought meat by weight, often served on butcher paper. The sides were minimal: white bread, crackers, pickles, onions, sauce, if present, was not always the point. In some places, Sauce was almost an insult, as if you were suggesting the meat needed help. A little dramatic, perhaps, very Texan, in those meat markets. Smoking was partly preservation, partly cooking, partly business logic. Butchers had cuts to sell. Smokehouses could turn less glamorous pieces into valuable food. Sausage used trimmings efficiently. Wrapping economy in casing and spice. Customers could come in, buy smoked meats, eat with their hands, and leave satisfied. No porcelain plates, no elaborate table service, no need to dress up, meat, paper, knife, bread. This was not fine dining. It was butcher shop practicality. Then practicality hardened into tradition. Central Texas barbecue developed a reputation for simplicity, especially salt and pepper seasoning, post-oak smoke, and an almost reverent focus on the meat itself. The phrase salt and pepper sounds plain until you realize plainness can be a form of confidence. The method says, we're not hiding anything, we're not drowning this in sugar, we're not asking sauce to rescue a mistake. Here is beef, here is smoke, here is time. If it fails, there's nowhere to hide. That is why Texas brisket became one of the great exams in American barbecue. A pitmaster has to manage heat for many hours, sometimes half a day or more, depending on size and method. The fat must render without drying the lean. The bark must darken without turning bitter. The smoke must perfume without overwhelming. Slice too soon, and juices run away. Hold it badly, and the texture suffers. Serve it dry, and everyone knows, everyone. Barbecue criticism in Texas can be gentle in tone and merciless in content. A person might smile politely, nod once, and then tell their entire family the brisket was dry for the next 15 years. But Texas barbecue is not only Central Texas brisket. That is the version that became nationally iconic, but the state contains many barbecue worlds. East Texas developed more chopped beef and pork traditions, often saucier, with closer ties to the American South and black barbecue culture. South Texas kept deep connections to Mexican barbacoa, including pit-cooked cowheads, cheek meat, lengua, and weekend traditions that still matter profoundly in many communities. West Texas often favors direct heat cooking over mesquite, sometimes called cowboy style. Each region tells a different story about migration, fuel, animals, and taste. So when someone says Texas barbecue, you should be suspicious of the singular. Texas is too big for one sentence. Roughly 268,000 square miles. 268,000. A place that large does not produce one barbecue tradition. It produces arguments wearing cowboy boots. The rivalry around Texas barbecue intensified as the 20th century moved on and roads. Newspapers, guidebooks, food television, and later the internet turned local preferences into public rankings. Lockhart called itself a barbecue capital. Austin became a stage for new school craft barbecue, where long lines formed outside restaurants that treated brisket with the seriousness of a rare manuscript. Places such as Kreutz Market, Smitty's, Louis Mueller Barbecue, City Market in Luling, and later Franklin Barbecue became pilgrimage sites for smoke devotees. Pilgrimage is not too strong a word. People wake before sunrise to stand in line for brisket. Think about that. In a country built on speed, drive-through windows, delivery apps, and microwave impatience, thousands of people willingly wait for meat that itself has already waited all night over smoke. That is the power of scarcity. That is also the power of story. Texas barbecue tells Americans something they like to believe about patience. toughness, independence, and craft. Some of that story is true, some of it is polished mythology. The records are full of overlooked contributors, especially Mexican, Black, German, Czech, and working-class cooks whose labour shaped the food before magazines and tourists arrived. The cowboy image sells well, but the pit was never tended by cowboys alone. Here is the fuller truth. Texas brisket is not just beef. It is Spanish cattle. It is Mexican barbacoa. It is German and Czech meat markets. It is black pit skill. It is railroad commerce. It is post oak, butcher paper, knives, salt, pepper, heat, and pride. And pride in Texas does not stay quiet. Kansas City could boast of variety. Texas answered with purity. Kansas City could offer sauce and abundance. Texas pointed to a slice of brisket and said, "Look at the smoke ring, look at the bark, look at the bend." No explanation needed, except, of course, Texans love explaining it. The fire had moved again, from indigenous frames to colonial pits, from plantation feasts to Reconstruction gatherings, from stockyard cities to Central Texas meat markets, and with each move, barbecue became less like a single food and more like a language with regional accents in Texas. That accent was beef, slow, stubborn, smoky beef, up the Mississippi River, the smoke-learned rhythm. Memphis did not build its barbecue identity in cattle country or beside the old meat markets of Central Texas. It built it on pork, river trade, black neighborhoods, working-class appetite, music, migration, and a city that has always known how to turn hardship into sound. If Texas barbecue asks you to admire the discipline of beef, Memphis barbecue asks you to pay attention to pork ribs, shoulders, dry rubs, sauce on the side, and the strange emotional power of a meal eaten near the river. The Mississippi matters here. You cannot understand Memphis without it. For centuries, the river moved people, goods, animals, cotton, timber, news, disease, music, money, and violence. Memphis was founded in 1819 on Chickasaw land, and its location made it a commercial hinge between the upland south and the wider world. Cotton flowed through the city. Enslaved people were bought and sold there. Steamboats came and went. Later, railroads deepened the city's connections. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Memphis was a place where rural foodways could become urban businesses. Barbecue needed exactly that. Pork had long been central to southern cooking, but Memphis gave it a particular urban shape. Hogs could be raised regionally, butchered, smoked, chopped, pulled, sauced, sliced, or served on bread. Pork shoulder became a workhorse cut, rich with fat and connective tissue, forgiving under slow smoke, generous enough to feed crowds. Ribs became something more theatrical. A rack of ribs is food you can see across a room. It has architecture, it has bones, it invites appetite before the first bite. And Memphis understood theatre. In the early 20th century, barbecue stands, cafes, and neighborhood joints appeared across the city, especially in black communities and working-class districts. Some were tiny operations, some were attached to homes, some served from counters, windows, or modest dining rooms. They fed people who did not need polished luxury. They needed something hot, affordable, filling, and good enough to return for after church, after work, after a late night, or after hearing music in a club where the walls sweated and the horns did not stop. The smell must have been impossible to ignore. Hickory smoke, pork fat, vinegar, pepper, tomato, molasses, onions, stale beer, river humidity, coal smoke, and summer heat rising off the streets. Memphis barbecue did not exist in a quiet countryside fantasy. It lived in an urban soundscape, streetcars, blues guitar, gospel singing, factory shifts, pool halls, preachers, trains, radios, arguments outside storefronts, somebody laughing too loudly near midnight. Food history is often written as if taste develops in silence. It does not. The two great Memphis forms became ribs and pulled or chopped pork shoulder. Ribs could be served wet, brushed with sauce during or after cooking, glossy and sticky in the way that makes napkins surrender immediately. Or they could be served dry, coated in a spice rub that clung to the meat and bark, emphasizing smoke, salt, paprika, pepper, garlic, and other seasonings rather than a thick sauce. Dry ribs became one of the city's calling cards, especially associated with Charlie Vergos Rendezvous, which opened as a restaurant in the mid-20th century and helped introduce generations of visitors to the idea that sauce did not need to do all the talking. That detail matters. A dry rib is not unsauced because someone forgot the sauce. It is a statement. It says texture matters, spice matters, smoke matters, the surface of the meat matters. You can add sauce if you want, but the rib should already know who it is. Very Memphis. Yet Memphis sauce developed its own identity too, compared with the mustard sauces of parts of South Carolina, or the thin vinegar pepper sauces of eastern North Carolina. Memphis sauce often leaned tomato-based, tangy, a little sweet, a little sharp, designed to complement pork rather than bury it. It could be served on sandwiches, ribs, shoulder, or alongside a plate. Like all barbecue sauce categories, this is not a law written in stone. It is a family of habits. Every restaurant, every cook, every aunt, every backyard specialist may insist the real version is theirs. That is how you know a food has become culture. One of the most famous Memphis barbecue dishes is the pulled pork sandwich, often served on a bun with slaw. Do not rush past the slaw. It is doing work. The pork brings smoke, fat, salt, and tenderness. The sauce brings acidity and sweetness. The slaw brings crunch, freshness, and a cold snap against warm meat. Together. It is essentially a working-class engineering solution disguised as lunch. Soft bread, rich pork, tangy sauce, crisp cabbage. It works because balance works. Memphis barbecue was also shaped profoundly by black cooks and entrepreneurs, although national fame did not always distribute credit fairly, as in Kansas City. Black pitmasters built much of the city's barbecue reputation through labor, skill, improvisation, and business ownership under segregation. Restaurants operated in a world where black customers and white customers often moved through different doors, different counters, different rules, and different dangers. The meat might cross racial lines more easily than the people who cooked it. Think about that for a second. A white customer could praise a black cook's ribs while supporting a society that denied that cook equals citizenship. That contradiction sat right on the plate. Still, barbecue businesses could provide black families with income, status, and community power. A good pitmaster had authority. A respected joint became a neighborhood landmark. A church barbecue could raise funds. A family recipe could become a livelihood. Smoke could turn skill into independence. Even if that independence had to push constantly against Jim Crow's walls, Memphis also made barbecue competitive long before television fully understood what it had found in the late 20th century. The city's barbecue reputation became anchored by the Memphis in May World Championship Barbecue Cooking Contest. First held in the 1970s, teams competed over whole hog, shoulder, and ribs. Judges evaluated tenderness, flavor, appearance, and technique. What had once been local craft became organized spectacle tents, trophies, sponsors, rules, secret rubs, and men standing near smokers with the seriousness of battlefield commanders. A little ridiculous, also completely understandable, because by then, Memphis barbecue had become one of the city's identities, alongside blues, soul, Beale Street, Stax, Sun Studio, and the painful memory of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968. That last memory matters. Memphis is not just music and ribs. It is also sanitation workers marching with signs that read, "I am a man." It is labor struggle, racial injustice, mourning, and resilience. To talk about Memphis food without that history would make the city too small. Barbecue there carries both pleasure and weight. So when Memphis enters America's barbecue rivalry, it does not come gently. It says pork matters. It says ribs matter. It says dry rub can stand beside sauce. It says a sandwich with slaw can be as iconic as brisket on butcher paper. It says the river shaped the city shaped the smoke, and the smoke shaped the argument. Kansas City had abundance, Texas had beef, Memphis had rhythm, pork, and bone, and once Memphis found its voice. The next argument was waiting just to the east, where sauce would become geography, theology, and family feud all at once. And then came the sauce wars. If you want to understand how barbecue became one of America's most passionate regional arguments, you eventually have to stand in the Carolinas and watch people turn vinegar, mustard, tomato, pepper, and pork into a map. Not a metaphorical map, a real edible geography, where a few tablespoons of sauce can tell you where someone is from, what they were raised eating, whose grandmother they trust, and which neighbouring county they believe has lost its way. That sounds excessive. It is also completely sincere. The Carolinas matter because they preserve some of the oldest continuous barbecue traditions in the United States, especially whole hog cooking in the eastern parts of North Carolina and South Carolina. Here, barbecue did not begin as brisket, ribs, burnt ends, or a mixed meat urban platter. It centered on the pig, not part of the pig, the whole animal, shoulder, ham, belly, skin, ribs, loin, fat, crackling, all cooked slowly until the parts could be chopped, pulled, mixed, and seasoned into something larger than any single cut. Whole hog is a philosophy, a shoulder says. This piece matters, a rack of ribs says. These bones matter, a brisket says. This difficult cut is the test. But a whole hog says the animal is the event. It takes more labour, more coordination, more space, more experience, and more people to eat it. It is communal by design. It belongs to churchyards, farms, political gatherings, family reunions, fundraisers, roadside restaurants, and towns where smoke is less a novelty than a weather condition. In eastern North Carolina, the classic sauce is thin, sharp, and vinegar-based, often with red pepper, no thick sweetness, no heavy tomato body, just acid, heat, salt, and enough bite to cut through pork fat. The sauce does not sit on top like frosting. It works its way through chopped meat. It brightens, it cleans, it wakes the pork up. In a world without refrigeration, vinegar was not just flavour. It was a preservative habit, a practical kitchen tool, and a familiar ingredient in British Atlantic foodways. Add peppers, shaped by indigenous American agriculture and global trade. And you get a sauce that is simple enough to seem obvious once you taste it. Fat needs acid, smoke needs sharpness, pork needs something that can push back. It worked. But travel west across North Carolina, and the story changes. In the Piedmont, especially around Lexington, barbecue became more associated with pork shoulder rather than whole hog, and the sauce often includes tomato or ketchup along with vinegar and pepper. This style is sometimes called Lexington style or Piedmont style, and it brings a redder, slightly sweeter, fuller character to the plate. The slaw often changes too, becoming red slaw, dressed with the same vinegar-tomato mixture rather than mayonnaise. Now, to outsiders, this may look like a minor adjustment. It is not minor. In North Carolina barbecue culture, the difference between Eastern vinegar sauce and Lexington-style dip can feel like a constitutional crisis. Eastern loyalists may say tomato has no business near true barbecue. Piedmont defenders may say the tomato gives balance, depth, and colour. Everyone claims authenticity. Everyone has evidence. Everyone knows a place that proves their point. The argument can be friendly, but it is never meaningless. Food arguments are rarely just about food. They are about inheritance. They are about belonging. They are about the first taste you trusted before you knew there were alternatives. They are about roads, rivers, farms, markets, migration, and memory. A sauce becomes a flag because people need flags small enough to put on a plate. Then South Carolina complicates everything. South Carolina barbecue is famous for its mustard sauce, especially in the central part of the state. A bright yellow, tangy, slightly sweet sauce often linked to German immigrant influence. German-speaking settlers arrived in significant numbers in the 18th century, and mustard was a familiar ingredient in their food traditions. Over time, in places such as the Midlands, mustard met pork and smoke and became something unmistakably local: golden sauce. That colour alone makes South Carolina barbecue look like it has entered the room wearing a louder shirt than everyone else. It is sharp, sweet, tart, and confident. It does not apologise for not being North Carolina vinegar sauce. It does not apologise for not being Kansas City red sauce. It simply lands on pork and announces that the Midlands have their own opinion, and they do. But South Carolina does not stop at mustard. Along the coast and in the PD region, you find vinegar and pepper traditions closer to eastern North Carolina. In other areas, tomato-based sauces appear. Some South Carolina barbecue maps identify 4 sauce zones: vinegar pepper, light tomato, heavy tomato, and mustard. 4 zones in one state. 4 zones. That is not culinary confusion. That is history refusing to simplify itself. The old colonial fault lines are still visible. The coast looked toward the Atlantic, plantations, rice, and ports. Inland areas reflected different migration patterns, different crops, different churches, different markets, German settlers, English settlers, enslaved Africans, native peoples, Scots-Irish migrants, and later generations of black and white cooks all shaped what pork tasted like in different places. The source records those movements quietly, Spoonful by spoonful, here is the detail that makes the Carolina rivalry especially intense. Each style can claim age. Eastern whole hog vinegar barbecue points deep into colonial and early American traditions. Mustard sauce can point to centuries of German influence in South Carolina. Lexington-style shoulder can point to the rise of market cooking, restaurants, and pork shoulder as a practical cut for commercial barbecue. None of them are fake. None of them are purely invented for tourists. They all come from real communities with real histories. That is why the argument never ends. If one style were obviously artificial, everyone could dismiss it. But each one has a claim. Each one has landscape behind it. Each one has families who have cooked that way for generations. Each one has restaurants where the pit has been burning since before some customers were born. The rivalry survives because the contenders are strong, and because people enjoy arguing when lunch is involved. The Carolina plate is often less theatrical than some other barbecue styles. But do not mistake plainness for lack of sophistication. Chopped whole hog with vinegar sauce, slaw, hush puppies, and maybe boiled potatoes or cornbread carries a deep logic. The meat is rich, the sauce is sharp, the slaw cools, the hush puppies add sweetness and crunch. The plate is balanced in a way that looks casual, only because generations have already solved the problem for you. That is the thing about old food traditions. They can seem effortless because the effort has been inherited by the 20th century. The Carolina sauce divisions became markers of local pride. Restaurants advertised their style. Newspapers explained the differences. Festivals celebrated them. Families carried sauces to reunions like heirlooms in jars. Tourists arrived looking for the real version, which is always a dangerous thing to ask, because someone will answer, and then someone else will overhear and correct them. The rivalry could be funny, but it also protected memory. In a country where chain restaurants flatten regional taste into sameness, Carolina barbecue insists that place matters. It insists that a sauce recipe is not interchangeable. It insists that smoke from a pit in eastern North Carolina is not the same cultural object as mustard sauce in South Carolina's Midlands or shoulder in Lexington. Same animal, different worlds. And this is where barbecue fully becomes America's great edible argument. Kansas City has its stockyard abundance. Texas has brisket discipline. Memphis has ribs and rhythm. The Carolinas have sauce as identity, geography, and inheritance. Each region says, this is the real thing. Each one is partly right. Each one is partly wrong. That is what makes the rivalry beautiful and impossible. Because barbecue was never one thing. It was fire, migration, labor, animals, wood, politics, trauma, celebration, and local pride. In the Carolinas, all of that reduced down into vinegar, mustard, tomato, pepper, and pork. A few ingredients, an entire history. By the time barbecue had divided itself into regions, the arguments were no longer side effects. They were part of the meal. A plate of barbecue could now tell a story before anyone picked up a fork. Thick sauce or thin sauce, beef or pork, whole hog or shoulder, ribs wet or dry, white bread or cornbread, pickles or slaw, mustard gold, vinegar clear, tomato red, pepper flecked, molasses sweet, smoke heavy, smoke gentle. Every choice carried a location, and every location carried a defense. This was how barbecue became more than food. It became loyalty. You can see the change clearly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when newspapers, railroads, automobiles, and roadside restaurants began turning local traditions into public identities. Before that, many people simply ate the barbecue of their region because that was what existed nearby. Local wood, local livestock, local cooks, local customs. But once travel became easier and cities grew larger, people encountered other versions. A Texan could taste Carolina pork. A Carolinian could hear Kansas City praised. A Memphian could watch a visitor drown ribs in sauce and quietly lose respect for him. Quietly, perhaps, maybe not quietly. The rivalry needed comparison, and modern America supplied it. Railroads moved people across regions. Newspapers wrote travel pieces. Food columns introduced readers to specialties from other states. Highways carried families past hand-painted signs that promised real pit barbecue, which is one of those phrases that sounds reassuring until you realize every rival sign says the same thing. Later, radio, television, magazines, guidebooks, and eventually the internet made regional pride louder, faster, and more theatrical. The food stayed slow, the argument sped up. Roadside barbecue joints became landmarks in the age of the automobile. A family driving across the South or Midwest could stop near a smokehouse, eat under fluorescent lights or at a picnic table, and leave with a new opinion. Those opinions hardened into stories. You did not just say you had lunch. You said you had the best ribs in Arkansas, the worst brisket in Georgia, the only proper sauce in eastern North Carolina, or a pulled pork sandwich that ruined every other sandwich forever. That is how food memory works. One meal becomes evidence. By the mid-20th century, barbecue had become a form of regional advertising. Chambers of commerce, state fairs, local festivals, and restaurant owners understood that smoke could attract travelers. Towns branded themselves through pits. Lockhart claimed barbecue royalty in Texas. Memphis built events around pork. Kansas City celebrated variety and sauce. Lexington, North Carolina, turned shoulder and red slaw into civic identity. Owensboro, Kentucky, defended mutton barbecue, because barbecue history always has room for one more region raising its hand and saying, "Excuse me, we have been here the whole time." Mutton matters, by the way, in western Kentucky, especially around Owensboro. Sheep meat became central to a local barbecue tradition tied to the region's sheep industry and Catholic Church fundraisers. The sauce, often called dip, could be dark, thin, savory, and strongly seasoned. To many outsiders, mutton barbecue arrives like a surprise witness in a courtroom. Most national barbecue maps focus on pork, beef, and ribs. And then Western Kentucky walks in smelling of smoke and sheep and asks why everyone forgot about it. That forgotten detail is useful because it reminds you that the famous rivalries are not the only ones. Alabama has white sauce, especially associated with northern Alabama and Big Bob Gibson's in Decatur, a mayonnaise-based sauce used famously with chicken. South Carolina has hash and rice. Georgia has Brunswick stew. St. Louis has its own rib-cut identity and sauce traditions. Santa Maria, California, has tri-tip cooked over red oak, with roots in ranching culture along the Central Coast. Barbecue is not a neat four-region chart. It is a crowded family reunion where half the cousins insist they should have been mentioned earlier. And they are not wrong. Still, the big rivalry structure became useful because it was easy to understand. Texas meant beef. Memphis meant ribs. Kansas City meant sauce and variety. Carolina meant pork and vinegar or mustard. Those labels are oversimplified, but oversimplifications travel well. They fit on menus, television segments, festival banners, and online rankings. They turn complexity into a bracket. Americans love brackets. Best barbecue city, best sauce, best pitmaster, best ribs, best brisket, best state. These debates are silly on the surface, but they reveal something deeper. Barbecue is one of the ways Americans talk about place in a country that often erases place. Chain stores make highways look similar. Airports feed everyone the same sandwiches. Suburbs repeat themselves from state to state. But barbecue refuses to become completely smooth. It clings to wood type, animal choice, sauce, serving style, and local memory. That refusal is part of its appeal. The rivalries also carry social history. When a city claims barbecue, it is often claiming a story about labor and migration. Kansas City claims stockyards, black entrepreneurship, and jazz. Texas claims cattle, immigrant meat markets, Mexican influence, and pit discipline. Memphis claims pork, the river, black neighborhoods, music, and working-class resilience. The Carolinas claim whole hog, colonial depth, vinegar, mustard, and stubborn county lines. The argument over flavor becomes an argument over who gets to define the past. Here is where it gets complicated. Many of the people most responsible for building these traditions were not the people most loudly credited when barbecue became a tourist economy. Black cooks, Mexican cooks, indigenous precedents, immigrant butchers, women in church kitchens, anonymous wage workers, and family-run operations shaped the food long before glossy magazines arrived. Yet national storytelling often prefers a simple hero, the pitmaster, as lone genius, usually framed through masculinity, fire, and secret technique. That story is appealing, it is also incomplete. Barbecue has always depended on communities. Someone raises the animal, someone slaughters it, someone hauls wood, someone makes sauce, someone prepares sides, someone serves customers, someone cleans after closing, someone keeps the old recipe alive. The pitmaster may stand in the smoke, and the pitmaster deserves respect. But the food is bigger than one person. It always has been. The rivalry, however, loves heroes. It loves champions. It loves rankings, trophies, and declarations. This place is best. That place is overrated. This sauce is authentic. That sauce is candy. This brisket bends correctly. That pork is chopped too fine. This rib has bite. That rib falls off the bone, which some people praise and others treat like a character flaw. Yes. Barbecue people argue about whether meat should fall off the bone, and yes, they mean it. By the late 20th century, these rivalries became entertainment. Food writers turned barbecue trails into pilgrimage routes. Television hosts praised smoke rings and bark. Festivals invited judges. Restaurants shipped sauce by mail. Families mailed relatives bottles from home because moving away from a region did not mean surrendering allegiance. Barbecue became portable again, just as barbacoa once had been. But now the transport was memory, branding, and desire. The irony is almost too perfect. A food born from ancient fire, indigenous technique, colonial violence, enslaved labor, immigrant adaptation, and local necessity became a recreational argument for Americans with full bellies. That does not make the argument meaningless. It makes it layered. So when someone says their city has the best barbecue, listen closely. They may be talking about flavor. They may be talking about childhood. They may be defending their grandparents, their neighborhood, their road trips, their church picnic, their Saturday routine, their dead father's smoker, or the place they had lunch the day they first felt at home. The rivalry is loud, the roots are tender, Then barbecue moved into the backyard. This may seem like the natural place for it, because today the backyard grill feels almost inevitable. A lawn chair, a cooler, a bag of charcoal, a spatula that has seen too much, smoke drifting over a fence while someone insists they know exactly when to flip the meat. But for most of barbecue's history, this was not the centre of the story. Barbecue belonged to pits, fields, plantations, town squares, church grounds, restaurants, roadsides, markets, and public gatherings. The backyard was a modern invention, not the yard itself, of course. People had cooked outdoors for thousands of years. But the idea of barbecue as a private family ritual tied to suburban leisure depended on a very specific 20th century world mass housing. Highways, consumer advertising, packaged fuel, cheap meat, rising wages for some Americans, and a powerful dream that the good life could be built behind a single family home. This was not ancient tradition simply continuing unchanged. It was industry selling tradition back to people in a cleaner package. Charcoal was one of the great turning points. Before modern packaged charcoal, outdoor cooking required managing wood, embers, ash, and patience in older ways. Then came briquettes, those small black pillows of compressed carbon that made fire seem standardized. The story often leads to Henry Ford, because in the 1920s, Ford's automobile empire produced enormous amounts of wood scrap from Model T production. Working with relatives and business partners, that waste helped feed a charcoal briquette business that eventually became associated with the Kingsford name. The idea was beautifully industrial: take leftover wood, compress it, package it, sell it, and turn waste into weekend leisure. A factory problem became a patio solution. That is very 20th century. Charcoal briquettes changed the psychology of fire. Instead of building a bed of coals from logs, a consumer could buy a bag, pour it into a grill, light it, and feel competent. The fire became more predictable, more portable, more suburban. It did not require a lifetime of pit knowledge. It required a match, lighter fluid, and confidence, sometimes too much confidence. The smell of lighter fluid became part of American memory, which is not exactly ancient woodcraft, but it is honest. After the Second World War, the backyard barbecue became even more powerful. Millions of Americans moved into suburbs, aided by federal policy, highway construction, mortgage systems, and a post-war economy that expanded home ownership for many white families, while often excluding black families through redlining, discrimination, and unequal access to loans. The backyard cookout became part of the image of middle-class comfort. Dad at the grill, Mum carrying a tray, children running through sprinklers, neighbours arriving with potato salad, smoke rising over a new fence. It looked casual. It was full of policy. Those tidy suburban scenes rested on who had access to property, credit, wages, safety, and leisure. For many families, the backyard grill symbolized arrival. For others, it symbolized exclusion. The same America that sold barbecue as democratic leisure also maintained housing systems that kept many black families and other marginalized communities out of the neighborhoods where that leisure was being advertised. This was not just cooking outside. It was the geography of opportunity. At the same time, manufacturers realized that barbecue could sell products far beyond meat. Grills, charcoal, lighter fluid, tongs, aprons, picnic tables, lawn furniture, paper plates, aluminum foil, coolers, bottled sauces, spice blends, hot dogs, hamburger buns, frozen patties, canned beans, and disposable napkins all found a place in the ritual. Barbecue became a retail ecosystem. A whole aisle could smell faintly of smoke without a single fire burning. By the 1950s and 1960s, gas grills also entered the picture, promising convenience, speed, and control. No ash, no waiting for coals to settle. Turn a knob, press an igniter, and dinner begins. Purists complained, because purists are never unemployed for long. But gas fit the post-war appetite for ease. It let people grill on weeknights. It made outdoor cooking feel less like tending a pit, and more like operating an appliance. An outdoor stove with better public relations. This shift also blurred the word barbecue. In many parts of the United States, especially outside the traditional barbecue regions, barbecue came to mean almost any outdoor grilling. Hamburgers, hot dogs, chicken breasts, steaks, kebabs, corn, even vegetables. Invite someone to a barbecue in California or New England, and they might expect grilled food generally, not 12-hour smoked pork shoulder. In Texas, the Carolinas, Memphis, or Kansas City. This broader usage can sound suspicious, even offensive. Words travel, meanings drift, arguments follow. The backyard version of barbecue did something else too. It changed who performed the cooking. In many American households, daily cooking had long been treated as women's work, whether paid, unpaid, praised, or ignored. But outdoor grilling was marketed heavily as masculine leisure. A man who rarely cooked dinner indoors could become lord of the grill outdoors, wearing an apron with a joke on it, and receiving applause for not burning the chicken. This was not because men had suddenly discovered food labor. It was because advertising made fire, meat, tools, and backyards feel safely masculine. Think about that for a second. The same task, cooking, changed gender in public imagination when it moved outside and acquired flames. That tells you something about culture, not meat. Industrialization also shaped the meat itself. The rise of refrigerated transport, supermarket chains, feedlots, industrial poultry, and national meatpacking made meat cheaper and more available to many Americans than it had been in earlier centuries. By the late 20th century, the average American ate far more meat than most people in the deep past could have imagined. Chicken parts, pork ribs, ground beef, steaks, sausages, and processed meats became regular cookout staples. Abundance became expected. Expected abundance is historically strange. For most of human history, a large public meat feast marked wealth, celebration, sacrifice, or rare good fortune. In the modern United States, a person could buy a plastic-wrapped tray of meat under fluorescent lights, carry it home, and decide casually whether Saturday felt like grilling weather. That is an astonishing transformation. Meat moved from seasonal scarcity to supermarket routine. Not for everyone equally. Food insecurity never vanished, but culturally. The cookout assumed plenty, and then came bottled sauce. Commercial barbecue sauces grew into national brands, often smoothing regional differences into sweet, tomato-based familiarity. Smoke flavor could be added in liquid form. Ribs could be parboiled, baked, broiled, sauced, and called barbecue. Frozen meals promised pit flavor without a pit. Fast food chains borrowed the word for sandwiches that had never seen smoke in their lives. Barbecue became a flavor profile, a potato chip seasoning, a pizza topping, a frozen nugget glaze, a fast casual adjective. The word that once described a wooden frame in the Caribbean now appeared on snack foods. That sounds ridiculous. It also proves how powerful the idea became. Industrial barbecue did not destroy old barbecue, but it changed the field around it. The more mass culture used the word loosely. The more regional specialists defended the older meanings. Pitmasters emphasized wood smoke, long cooks, heritage techniques, whole hogs, brisket bark, rib texture, and hand-built tradition. Backyard cooks experimented with smokers, pellets, offsets, Kamado cookers, and recipes copied from television or the internet. Industry made barbecue easier, but ease created longing for difficulty. That is the modern twist. A food once born from necessity became a hobby built around inconvenience. People now spend large sums of money to recreate slowness. They wake early to manage fires. They track temperatures. They argue over wood moisture. They buy equipment to imitate an older world where people cooked slowly because they had no other choice. Barbecue entered the backyard as convenience. And somehow, convenience made people miss the smoke. And then barbecue learned how to keep score. That may sound strange. Because barbecue had always been competitive in spirit. Families compared sauces. Towns compared restaurants. Regions compared animals. A person could insult your brisket, your ribs, your sauce, your wood choice, your chopping style, your slaw, your smoke ring, your entire upbringing, and somehow still claim the conversation was friendly. Rivalry was baked into the culture long before anyone handed out trophies. But organized competition changed the nature of the argument. It took something local, messy, and often deeply personal, then put it under tents, inside rules, in front of judges, beside scorecards, with categories, deadlines, prize money, sponsors, team names, and enough stainless steel to make the old pitmasters blink. Suddenly barbecue was not only something you inherited, practiced, served, and defended, it was something you could win or lose, and people took that very seriously. The rise of competition barbecue in the late 20th century grew from festivals, civic celebrations, restaurant promotion, agricultural events, and regional pride. Memphis in May became one of the great stages for pork, especially whole hog, shoulder, and ribs. The American Royal in Kansas City grew into a massive gathering of teams and smoke. Local cook-offs appeared across the country, some tied to charity, some to tourism, some to pure bragging rights. What began as celebration became a circuit. A circuit needs rules. Rules are where barbecue gets funny, and also revealing. In ordinary life, barbecue can be flexible. A grandmother may cook by sight. A pitmaster may work by instinct. A church volunteer may know from the sound of the chop whether the pork is right. But judges need standards, they need categories, they need turn-in times, they need portions that can be compared fairly. They need boxes arranged in particular ways, sometimes with garnish, sometimes without. They need bite, tenderness, appearance, taste, texture, and consistency. In other words, they need to turn memory into numbers. That is almost impossible. A rib that makes one person close their eyes in joy may make a competition judge mark down tenderness because it pulls too cleanly from the bone. Brisket that tastes perfect to someone raised on heavy smoke may feel over-smoked to another judge. Sauce that speaks of childhood may be considered too sharp, too sweet, too thin, too thick, or too regional. Competition barbecue had to create a common language. But barbecue's old power came from refusing to be common. That tension never went away. Competition also encouraged a new style of cooking. Judges taste many samples, often in quick succession. So competitors learned to make bites that exploded with flavor immediately. Sweetness increased in some categories. Glazes became shinier. Chicken skin had to be bite through. Ribs has to leave a clean mark. Pork was arranged into perfect pieces. Brisket slices had to bend without breaking and hold together without crumbling. Burnt ends, once humble scraps, became jewel-like cubes of concentrated fat, smoke, sugar, and spice. This was not necessarily how people ate at home. It was barbecue optimized for judgment. Pay attention to that, because it explains why competition barbecue can feel both impressive and oddly artificial. The skill is real. The fire management is real. The pressure is real. But the target is different. Feeding a family reunion is not the same as impressing a judge with one bite. Running a restaurant line is not the same as turning in 6 perfect rib bones at exactly the right minute. Cooking a whole hog for a community fundraiser is not the same as building a box that survives scrutiny under a tent. Competition did not replace tradition. It created another branch, and that branch had stars. Television loved competition barbecue because it had everything producers wanted: fire, meat, tension, regional accents, secret recipes, ticking clocks, confident people, disappointed people, and dramatic reaction shots over slices of brisket. Food Network, Travel Channel, public television, streaming shows, and YouTube all helped turn pitmasters into personalities. Suddenly viewers who had never cooked a pork shoulder could explain bark formation, smoke rings, offset smokers, and the difference between spare ribs and baby backs with the confidence of a retired livestock judge. The internet made it louder. Forums, blogs, recipe sites, barbecue channels, and social media spread techniques that once stayed local. A backyard cook in Oregon could learn Central Texas brisket methods. A British viewer could order American-style rubs. An Australian team could compete in American barbecue formats, while mixing them with local fire traditions. Pellet smokers let people manage temperatures with electronic controllers. Digital probes sent alerts to phones. Mail-order meat suppliers shipped prime briskets across the country. Barbecue became both more democratic and more expensive. That is one of the modern contradictions. The old method required wood, meat, time, and knowledge. The new hobby can require $1,000 smokers, premium cuts, branded rubs, injections, butcher paper, insulated gloves, coolers, trimming knives, thermometers, online classes, and a willingness to speak passionately about airflow. A food with roots in necessity, survival, and low-cost cuts became, in some circles, a luxury pastime. The brisket tells the story, once a relatively tough practical cut. Brisket became so celebrated that demand helped raise prices. The cut that proved patience could redeem toughness became a premium object. What had been humble all became elite. Again, barbecue does that over and over. At the same time, competition culture gave many pitmasters new opportunities. Skilled cooks could build reputations, sell sauces, open restaurants, teach classes, launch catering businesses, publish cookbooks, and reach audiences far beyond their towns. Women, long essential to barbecue labor but often erased from the public image, increasingly claimed space in competitions, restaurants, media, and ownership. Black pitmasters and historians pushed harder for recognition of barbecue's roots in enslaved and free black labor. Latino, Asian American, indigenous, and immigrant cooks brought their own flavors into the competition and restaurant worlds, expanding what American barbecue could mean. The old gatekeepers did not disappear, but the gates moved. Still, competition barbecue can sometimes flatten history. A judge's table may reward a polished style without asking where the method came from. A television segment may celebrate a charismatic pitmaster without naming the generations behind him. A festival may use barbecue as entertainment while avoiding slavery. Segregation, displacement, and labor. The smoke becomes aesthetic, the past becomes decoration. This is where careful storytelling matters, because barbecue's rise into trophies and television is not a betrayal of the old story. It is part of the old story's transformation. The same food that once gathered voters now gathers sponsors. The same smoke that once marked a church fundraiser now rises from branded trailers. The same rivalries that once lived in family arguments now live in score sheets, rankings, and viral videos. The stage changed, the hunger did not. And halfway through this modern spectacle, after the trophies are polished and the cameras move closer to the cutting board, it is worth pausing for one small thing. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because what came next was bigger than America. By the early 21st century, American competition barbecue had become a global export. Teams formed in Europe, Australia, Asia, and South America. Restaurants abroad copied Texas brisket, Kansas City ribs, Memphis dry rubs, and Carolina pulled pork. American smokers appeared in places where the local fire traditions were already ancient. The word barbecue, which had travelled from the Caribbean into empire and then into the United States, began circling outward again. But this time it met other fires, and those fires had their own histories. Once barbecue became a global American export, it ran into an awkward truth. America did not own fire. That sounds obvious, almost too obvious to say, but it matters because modern American barbecue has become so famous, so branded, so filmed, judged, ranked, and argued over, that it can sometimes appear to be the centre of the smoked meat universe. It is not. It is one branch of a much older human forest, a powerful branch, a delicious branch, a branch with very strong opinions about brisket, but still only one branch. Around the world, people have cooked meat over flame, coal, smoke, stone, and pit for thousands of years. They have done it in deserts, forests, mountains, islands, cities, villages, backyards, street markets, religious festivals, wedding feasts, funeral gatherings, and late-night stalls where the smoke clings to your clothes long after you've gone home. The technique is universal because the problem is universal. Meat is tough. Fire changes it. Smoke marks it. Sharing it makes people gather. That is the deep pattern. Korean barbecue, for example, is not American barbecue in miniature. It is its own world of tabletop grilling. Marinated meats, scissors, lettuce wraps, banchan, dipping sauces, charcoal, conversation, and speed. Beef short ribs, called galbi, and thinly sliced bulgogi can be cooked in front of you while the table fills with kimchi, pickled radish, soybean paste, garlic, sesame oil, and little dishes that make the meal feel like abundance arranged in circles. This is not low and slow in the Texas sense. It is interactive, social, immediate, and precise. Same fire family, different grammar. In Brazil, churrasco grew from cattle culture, especially in the southern regions, where gauchos cooked meat over open flames and embers, large cuts, skewers, salt, smoke, and fire became a way of feeding people in ranching landscapes. In modern churrascarias, servers move through dining rooms with skewers of beef, pork, lamb, chicken, and sausage, slicing meat directly onto plates until the entire experience begins to feel like a generous mistake you keep agreeing to. It is theatrical, yes, but underneath the theatre is a long relationship among cattle, land, migration, labour, and flame. In Argentina and Uruguay, asado is not simply grilled meat. It is a social institution. Ribs, sausages, offal, steaks, and other cuts cook slowly over coals or beside the fire under the eye of the asador, the person responsible for managing the meal. The timing is relaxed but not careless. The gathering may stretch for hours. Chimichurri adds herbs, garlic, vinegar, and oil. The fire is watched, adjusted, respected. The meat arrives when it is ready, not when impatience demands it. You recognize that feeling by now. Fire teaches patience. In South Africa, braai carries its own national meaning tied to outdoor cooking, family, friends, meat, sausage, chops, chicken, and flame. The word comes from Afrikaans, and the practice crosses communities, though not without the complicated history of a country shaped by colonialism, apartheid, land dispossession, and inequality. A braai can feel warm and communal, but like American barbecue, it sits inside history. Food can unite people at a table while the country around that table remembers division. That is not a reason to reject the warmth. It is a reason to tell the truth. In Jamaica, jerk cooking carries another kind of fire history. Its roots are tied to indigenous Taino techniques and to maroon communities. Africans who escaped slavery and built free settlements in the mountains, seasoned with Scotch bonnet peppers, allspice, thyme, and other ingredients. Jerk pork and chicken developed through survival, resistance, concealment, and adaptation. The smoke was not only flavour, in some tellings. Covered pits and smoky cooking methods helped avoid detection while creating intensely seasoned food in difficult terrain. The exact details vary by region and family memory, but the larger truth is firm enough. Jerk is not just spice, it is resistance with heat in it. Think about that for a second. A tourist may encounter jerk as a beach lunch, wrapped in foil beside music and rum. But underneath the burn of pepper is a history of flight from plantations, mountain refuge, indigenous knowledge, African survival and colonial violence, fire again, not just cooking, freedom. In the Philippines, lechon turns the whole pig into celebration, slowly roasted until the skin becomes shatteringly crisp. In Indonesia, satay places skewered meat over coals and serves it with peanut sauce, chili, shallots, and rice cakes. In Turkey and across the Middle East, kebab traditions turn grilled meat into a vast family of forms, from skewers to minced preparations to slow-cooked meats served with bread, herbs, yogurt, and smoke. In China, char siu glazes pork with sweetness, fermentation, and roast heat, producing red-edge slices that glow in shop windows like edible lacquer. Some are smoked, some are grilled, some are roasted, some are pit-cooked, some are fast, some take all day. All belong to the wider human story of fire and food. So when American barbecue travels abroad, it does not enter empty space. It enters countries that already have their own fire traditions. This creates fascinating hybrids. In Japan, American-style brisket may meet meticulous knife work and local woods. In Mexico, Texas barbecue can meet barbacoa, cabrito, tortillas, salsas, and borderland identity, making the old word circle back toward home. In Australia, American low and slow has grown alongside a strong local grilling culture where smokers, competitions, and brisket sit beside sausages, lamb, and seafood. In Britain, American barbecue restaurants taught customers to wait for smoked meat in a country long associated, fairly or not, with less dramatic outdoor cooking weather. Rain is a serious pitmaster. The global spread also raises questions. What counts as barbecue? Is it only low and slow smoke? Is grilling included? Does the word belong to American regional styles? Or can it describe any communal fire cooking? The answer depends on language, place, and how loudly the person answering wants to argue. In the United States, barbecue specialists often defend a narrower meaning. Elsewhere, barbecue often means grilling outdoors in general. Neither usage is completely wrong. Words live by use, not by committee. But the tension reveals something important. American barbecue became globally powerful because it combined flavor with story. Brisket was not just beef. It was Texas patience. Ribs were not just pork. They were Memphis rhythm. Burnt ends were not just smoked pieces. They were Kansas City abundance. Whole hog was not just an animal. It was Carolina inheritance. The stories travelled with the smoke, and people abroad wanted both. At the same time, global fire traditions remind American barbecue to be humble. The United States did not invent cooking meat over fire. It did not invent communal feasting. It did not invent smoke, patience, spice, or rivalry. What it did was create a distinctive set of barbecue cultures from indigenous knowledge, African labour and creativity, European livestock, immigrant butchery, Mexican ranching, Caribbean language, industrial meat, road travel, television, competition, and regional pride. That is impressive enough, no need to claim the whole flame. And now, in the modern world, barbecue keeps evolving. Pitmasters smoke cauliflower, mushrooms, jackfruit, fish, goat, lamb, turkey, and plant-based meats. Restaurants combine brisket with ramen, ribs with gochujang, pulled pork with tacos, smoked meats with Filipino, Vietnamese, Caribbean, and West African flavors. Some traditionalists groan. They always do. But barbecue has never been pure. It has always changed when people moved, traded, suffered, adapted, and tasted something new. Barbecue was fusion before fusion had a menu font. So the story that began with ancient smoke and Caribbean barbacoa does not end in an American competition tent. It spreads outward again, meeting other fires, other woods, other animals, other memories. The old pattern repeats, a technique travels, a word changes, a community claims it. Someone says, "This is the real version." Someone else says, "No, taste mine." And somewhere, as always, meat meets smoke, the argument continues. And now the smoke comes back to you. Not to a battlefield, not to a plantation yard, not to a Caribbean village, not to a stockyard city, not to a Texas meat market before sunrise, but to the ordinary modern moment where barbecue feels familiar enough that you may forget how much history is sitting on the plate. A rib, A sandwich, a slice of brisket, a spoonful of beans, a stain of sauce on a paper napkin. Something casual, something weekend, something you can order from a counter, pick up from a roadside joint, make in a backyard, or argue about with someone who is absolutely convinced their region has already settled the matter. It has not. That is the wonderful problem with barbecue. It looks simple only from a distance. Meat, wood, smoke, time. 4 words, almost nothing. And yet inside those 4 words is almost the whole human story. It was there when early people learned that flame could soften meat, and smoke could stretch survival beyond the day of the hunt. It was there when indigenous cooks in the Caribbean and across the Americas used frames, pits, embers, leaves, fish, game, maize, peppers, and fire with knowledge that did not need European permission to be sophisticated. It was there when Spanish chroniclers heard something like barbacoa and carried the word into imperial language while the communities behind it were being shattered. It was there when pigs rooted through colonial landscapes, when English settlers borrowed, adapted, misunderstood, and depended on food systems they did not create. It was there when public feasts gathered voters, militias, churchgoers, neighbours, candidates, and crowds. It was there when a whole hog could become an advertisement for generosity and authority. It was there when enslaved black cooks stood through heat, smoke, ash, and exhaustion to create the abundance that white hosts claimed as their own. It was there when the Civil War scattered families, destroyed farms, consumed animals, and turned smoke from celebration into danger. It was there when emancipation gatherings transformed public meals into declarations of survival, freedom, and memory. It was there in Kansas City where stockyards, railroads, jazz, black entrepreneurship, and industrial meat turned barbecue into an urban crossroads. It was there in Texas where cattle culture, Mexican barbacoa, German and Czech meat markets, black pit skill, post oak, salt, pepper, and stubborn pride made brisket into a test of patience. It was there in Memphis, where pork, the Mississippi River, blues, labor, neighborhood joints, dry ribs, wet ribs, and slaw on a sandwich gave smoke its own rhythm. It was there in the Carolinas, where vinegar, mustard, tomato, pepper, whole hog, shoulder, and county lines became edible geography. It was there when Americans built highways and roadside restaurants. It was there when families packed into cars and began turning lunch into regional loyalty. It was there when charcoal briquettes turned industrial scraps into backyard ritual. It was there when post-war suburbs sold the grill as a symbol of comfort, even as the dream of that comfort was distributed unequally. It was there when gas grills, bottled sauce, frozen meats, supermarket abundance, and advertising transformed barbecue from a public feast into a private leisure industry. It was there when competitions turned memory into scores, when judges evaluated tenderness by the bite, when pitmasters became television figures, when brisket prices rose, when burnt ends stopped being scraps and became treasures, when a food rooted in necessity became a hobby expensive enough to require a serious conversation with your bank account. And it was there when American barbecue went global again, meeting Korean galbi, Brazilian churrasco, Argentina asado, South African braai, Jamaican jerk, Filipino lechon, Indonesian satay, Middle Eastern kebab, Chinese char siu, and 1,000 other fires that remind you of the obvious truth. America did not invent cooking over flame. It made one extraordinary, complicated, painful, joyful, argumentative version of it. That is enough. Barbecue does not need a single birthplace because it is not a single thing. It is a method and a meal, a noun and a verb, a technique and an event, a flavour and a memory. It is ancient and modern. It is indigenous and African and European and Mexican and immigrant and industrial and suburban and global. It is smoke in a village, smoke on a plantation, smoke in a black neighbourhood, smoke behind a meat market, smoke beside a highway, smoke in a competition lot, smoke in your neighbour's yard. It built communities, it hid injustices, it created businesses, it preserved memories, it fed crowds, it started arguments. So when someone asks which barbecue is best, the honest answer is not simple. The best barbecue might be the brisket someone waited 6 hours to buy in Austin. It might be whole hog chopped with vinegar in eastern North Carolina. It might be ribs in Memphis, burnt ends in Kansas City, mustard pork in South Carolina, mutton in Kentucky, chicken with white sauce in Alabama, tri-tip in Santa Maria, barbacoa in South Texas, jerk in Jamaica, or a backyard sausage handed to you on a paper plate by someone who is proud of the fire they managed. Best is not always a ranking. Sometimes best is the place where history becomes personal, because that is the final trick of barbecue. It can carry centuries and still arrive as lunch. You do not have to recite the whole story every time you eat it. Nobody wants a lecture between the ribs and the slaw, especially if the food is getting cold. But the story is there whether you name it or not, in the wood, in the sauce, in the animal, in the labour, in the borrowed word, in the regional pride, in the family argument, in the quiet moment when smoke rises and everyone turns their head before they even know why. Your body understands a signal before your mind explains it. Fire, food, gather. That may be why barbecue has lasted so long. It speaks to something older than nation, older than restaurants, older than recipes written on index cards. It says wait. It says share. It says someone tended this for you. It says the cheap cut can become precious. The overlooked scrap can become famous. The ordinary meal can become memory. Not bad for meat, smoke, and an argument nobody has managed to win. So the next time you lift a rib, slice brisket, pull pork from a bun, or smell smoke drifting across a summer evening, remember the long road that brought it there. Ancient fires, Caribbean frames, colonial hunger, plantation labour, war, freedom, railroads, stockyards, meat markets, rivers, sauce wars, backyards, trophies, global tables. Barbecue is never just barbecue. It never was. If this story surprised you, do me a favour and hit subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling me which part of barbecue history you did not expect. There are many more everyday foods with histories just as smoky, strange, and revealing. And I will see you in the next one. Sleep well,